is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Policy goal 9 is to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Policy goal 10 is to reduce inequality within and among countries. Policy goal 11 is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Policy goal 12 is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Policy goal 13 is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Policy goal 14 is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Policy goal 15 is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and out and reverse land degradation and out biodiversity loss. Policy goal 16 is to promote peaceful and inclusive society for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Policy goal 17 is to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. And another particular framework for development agenda that Africa has actually signed into is the Agenda 2063, which encapsulates Africa's development and transformation priorities for the coming 5 decades. Agenda 2063 comprises 7 overarching aspirations, 34 priority areas, 20 goals, 174 targets, and 200 indicators. Agenda 2063 is divided into 5 10-year implementation periods. The first 10-year implementation plan covers the period 2013 and 2023. Goal and aspiration of Agenda 2063. We want a prosperous Africa that is based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. An integrated continent, politically united, based on the ideas of Pan-Africanism and the vision of African Renaissance. Number 3, an African of good governance, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. Number 4, a peaceful and secure Africa. Number 5, an Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, values, and ethnicity. Number 6, an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and young people, and caring for children. Number 7, Africa as a strong, united, resilient, and influential global player and partner. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals fit neatly into the 20 goals of Agenda 2063. That is, there is interconnectivity between Sustainable Development Goals and then the Agenda 2063. They are all encapsulated in the 20 goals of Agenda 2063. Sustainable Development Goals scope is combined to social, economic, and environmental dimensions. Agenda 2063 is broader in scope, covering social, economic, and sustainability considerations in the broad context, political, cultural, and other African priorities. Therefore, by implementing Agenda 2063, member states will simultaneously be meeting global obligations under the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the linkage between resource mobilization and investment for structural transformation. Just like I mentioned in the earlier time that we are not mobilizing resources in Africa just for the fun of mobilization, but we actually want it to be transformed, translated to investment, which is actually going to now transform African economy into a better economic system across the continent. So, if you are trying to look at this, that means we need to assess the barriers to unlock African economic potentials. Africa has tremendous economic potentials and offers rewarding opportunities for global businesses looking for new markets and long-term investment with favorable returns. However, there are certain challenges, or what I call constraints and barriers, that affect the potentials of African economies in order to be able to mobilize domestic resources, translate them to investment for structural transformation of the African continent. One of them is lower level of competition. In Africa, there is a high level of monopolies. Prevalence of monopolies, duopolies, and oligopolies is relatively high in some African economies. Unemployment and underemployment, underinvestment in infrastructure, high labor cost enigma, fiscal crisis, political change that is quite often, as well as the climate change that is now pervading the economy. These are more or less the barriers that are affecting the potentials of African economies in being able to mobilize enough domestic resources for economic development. Then requirements of what the African economics need to achieve structural transformation. In order to achieve structural transformation, African countries need infrastructure, skills, and competition. These are key elements on the investment climate. Government needs to develop a package of trade and exchange rate policies, public investments, regulatory reforms, and institutional changes designed to increase the share of non-traditional exports in GDP. There is need for transformation of the structure of a predominantly agrarian, semi-subsistence economy that cannot be achieved without substantial increases in agricultural productivity. The structural transformation process must take advantage of the positive interactions between agricultural and industrial development. Governments can support agglomerations by concentrating investment in high-quality institutions and infrastructure in a special economic zone. Now, the theoretical linkage between resources mobilized and investment. When you mobilize resources, you expect it to be transformed to investment. That means saving and investment are defined in such a way that they are necessarily equal to each other. Savings brings about investment and growth, and it brings about balanced growth, but it's subject to certain conditions before you can bring about investment and bring about goods. There must be certain conditions that has actually be taken into consideration. In economic equilibrium, investment is equal to saving. But if savings is higher than investment, the savings surplus will lead to a decrease of interest rates, and this, as a result, will lower the level of saving and increase the investment level until equilibrium between both variables is reached. If investment is higher than savings, then the high level of interest rates attracts more in savings. Money supply decreases interest rates until the equilibrium condition is restored. So whenever there is a gap between investment and savings, it tries to equilibrate itself along the line. So if Africa is to make significant progress in reducing poverty, it will have to sustain average growth rates of about 7% and above in the medium to long term, which will require investment rate of about 25% of gross domestic product and above. That means in any particular point in here, Africa must have 7% growth rate and also an investment framework that is about 20% of the gross domestic product. There is a need to ensure that investment is allocated to strategic or priority sectors as well. Investment and equity funding for small and medium scale enterprises and startup links to SDG. Small and medium scale enterprises have tremendous potential to make an impact on the sustainable development goals through the employment that they generate, the business practices they choose to adopt, the sectors in which they operate, and their impact on innovation and diversification in the economy. Approaches to investing in small businesses. So we have several diverse approaches in investing, but some of them are mentioned here. Impact investment is expanding and can benefit small firms. Blended finance can also be used for SMEs. Sustainable development bonds can be used for SMEs as well as trade finance. In order for the SMEs to be investors ready, they must have training programs, adequate training programs that being plans, quality signals, In order for the SMEs to be investors ready, they must have training programs that brings them up to date to the frontier of knowledge, uh, strong business plans, quality signals and visibility, online investment matching, understanding risk from the perspective of private investors. So this is like a trajectory framework in which the four investment partnership for sustainable development. You have the startup investors, individual investors, foreign direct investors, as well as investment funds. And the facilitators becomes accelerators, crowdfunding platforms, investment promotion agencies, local financial institutions. And then you have businesses that you have startup and social SME suppliers as well as SMEs. And this fits in into the sustainable development goals that you have actually highlighted: nine, policy goal 9, policy goal 7, policy goal 8, and policy goal 8 again. So linking domestic resource mobilization investment with bilateral investment treaties. A bilateral investment treaty could help attract investment by serving as a commitment device. The BIT, that is the bilateral investment treaty, has been touted as an important commitment device that attracts foreign investors. The number of bilateral investment treaties ratified by developing countries has therefore grown dramatically because they know this is an opportunity of bringing in foreign investors. As foreign direct investment has surged dramatically over the last 2 decades, more developing countries are now competing to host these multinationals. In addition to negotiating firm-specific deals through tax incentives, subsidies, countries have increasingly turned to signing bilateral investment treaties (BITs) as a way to entice foreign investors to their shores. However, the nature of the commitment can vary enormously depending on the terms of the BIT. Too much attention has been placed on whether or not a bilateral investment treaty exists than on the strength of the property rights actually enshrined in this agreement. So we need to take a look at the property rights and the opportunity that this actually offered to African economies. So we need to look at the criticality of establishing a conducive investment climate in Africa. The business environment in many countries remain discouraging in Africa. Businesses struggle to register, to obtain necessary licenses, that is for their businesses, to move their goods in and out of the country, and to meet their statutory obligations like paying taxes. When they enter into commercial disputes, resolving them is often a lengthy and costly process and can potentially be a matter of life or death for smaller enterprises. In an effort to attract investment, many African countries have been taking measures to improve the business environment in their countries. But we believe that a lot more needs to be done to boost private investment on the continent. African countries have to enhance investment performance by creating an environment that allows businesses to operate in a secure, hassle-free, and conducive manner. This requires the creation of government policies and regulations that encourage businesses to grow and to perform better, faster, and more innovatively. It also necessitates the reforming of the administrative environment to ensure that it encourages rather than hinders business performance. So, like I mentioned earlier on, resource mobilization and the COVID-19 pandemic. The implication of COVID-19 for resource mobilizations in Africa. In March 2020, the International Labour Organization projected that COVID-19 can lead to a loss of about 25 million jobs in Africa. However, the reality appears more severe, and the actual job losses could be significantly higher than the projection that comes from the International Labour Organization. Urban-based sectors, particularly manufacturing and services, which currently account for 64% of African GDP, are expected to be hit hard by COVID-19 with substantial losses of productive jobs. Particularly affected are small businesses in trade, that is in the distributive trade and external trade, hospitality, tourism, and manufacturing, where a whopping 90% of the businesses expect at least a 10% decrease in their 2020 revenues compared to 2019. Remittances, an important income source or supplement for numerous households in Africa, have also declined. The sources of revenues that will be hit particularly hard include licenses and fees, local service taxes, user fees, property taxes, and other revenues. So look at the effects, the first order effects on economy, on social and political environment. The second order effects on economic, social and political environment, as well as the third order effects on the economy, on the social and the political. Let's take an example for the first order effects. The gross domestic product drops under the economy, trade balance worsening, that is, imports is higher than exports, job and livelihood losses, wealth depletion, increased health and related spending. Under the social perspective, under the first order effect, there's loss of life, there's social spending reduced, disproportionate impact on vulnerable groups, as well as social services disrupted. With respect to political, then there's politicized responses. In the case of economic, for the third order effects, you have recession, you have debt crisis, you have financial distress. And under the third order effects for political, you have political unrest, like that's actually currently being witnessed in Nigeria now, as well as political violence as a result of the challenges from the COVID-19 pandemic. And that also brings us to the impact of COVID-19 on gross domestic products and trade as a way of looking at the issues in a deeper perspective. COVID-19 has generated shocks for GDP and international trade. The shocks are divided into 4 sets, but all are assumed to occur simultaneously. The first shock is a drop in employment. With lower availability of labor, we will expect wages, all things being equal, ceteris paribus, to rise, while return to capital is unchanged under our assumptions. With respect to the second shock, cumulative with the supply shock, raises the international trade cost of imports and export by 25%. The third shock entails a sharp drop in international tourism. The fourth shock represents a demand switch by households who purchase fewer services requiring close human interactions, such as mass transport, domestic tourism, restaurants, and recreational activities, while redirecting demand towards consumption of goods and services. Now, understanding the impact of COVID-19 outbreak on the African economies. Africa, because of its openness and international trade and migration, is not immune to the harmful effects of COVID-19, which are of two kinds, endogenous and exogenous. Endogenous is within the system, while exogenous are issues outside the system. The exogenous effects come from the direct trade links between affected partner countries of Africa, such as Asia, Europe, and the United States. Tourism, the decline in remittances from the African diaspora, foreign direct investment and official development assistance, illicit financing flows, and domestic financial market tightening. The endogenous effects occur as a result of the rapid spread of the virus in many African countries. On one hand, they are linked to morbidity and mortality. On the other hand, they lead to a disruption of economic activities. This has caused a decrease in domestic demand in tax revenue due to the loss of oil and commodity prices, coupled with an increase in public expenditure. So this is one of the challenges that is actually the part of the endogenous part of the effect of COVID-19 on African economies. Then, approaches for a better resource mobilization in the post-COVID environment. African countries are extremely exposed to external shocks. A paradigm shift is needed in order to change the trade patterns of African countries within themselves and with the rest of the world, particularly with China, Europe, with USA, and other emerging economies in the Western world. Africa should turn the current COVID-19 pandemic into an opportunity to translate the policy recommendations on productive transformation. Therefore, African countries are advised to diversify and transform their economies by strengthening the productive capacity of African private sector to transform raw materials locally. Take economic and financial measures to support enterprises, small and medium-scale enterprises, and individuals as a response to temporary jobs cuts to safeguard economic activities, such as guarantees to private sector debt. Request central banks to lower interest rates to increase loans to businesses and decrease their cost and provide commercial banks with more liquidity to support business activities. Waive immediately all interest payments on trade credits, corporate bonds, lease payments, and activation of liquidity lines for central banks to ensure countries and businesses can continue the purchase of essential commodities without weakening the banking sector. Initiate fiscal stimulus packages to minimize the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the national economies. Africa needs to renegotiate external debt payment plans and conditions to ensure smooth servicing of the debt, including suspension of interest rate payments for the time of the crisis, which are estimated at $44 billion for 2020, and possible extensions of plan duration. Set up innovative ways of spending on health. Government should boost investments that strengthen health systems to enable faster treatment and containment. Mobilize sufficient domestic resources for health to enable health system to meet the needs in health services, including elimination of high-burden diseases, prevention and management of outbreak on the continent. Finally, to also continue promoting productive transformation and private sector development to transform locally produced African commodities. So, some of the questions that I actually want people to reflect on include: what is the domestic resource gap in your country? And why do you think you need to mobilize domestic resources for investment, for structural transformation in your country? Can aid, including new foreign aid modalities such as incentive-based budget support, provide support to tax reforms? How did COVID-19 affect the mobilization of resources in your country? Do you support the choice of foreign aid as against domestic resource mobilization for Africa economic development? How do you think African economics can be insulated from structural external shocks, given their dependence on primary commodities as revenue sources? How can the aspiration of African development agenda be met given the COVID-19 pandemic? You also have what I called motivating questions at the beginning of the Microsoft Word document that shows the narrative in detail of what I have presented. And also you have questions, other supportive questions, discussion questions, and also case study that I want you to put your hands on and then give it a try to answer those set of questions. All that runs all through the sections in this introductory module. I look forward to meeting you to get your response and comments and questions and discussion framework as we go along in the course of the course delivery on domestic resource mobilization in Africa. Thank you very much, everybody. Merci beaucoup.